Part of what happened in the Renaissance was actually that whole human development, interdisciplinary, really putting the emphasis on the many dimensions of the human being. Do you think AI is actually opening the door for that?
I think that what AI is going to do is it's going to give us information at new levels, at the level of particles and biomaterials and such things. And that's going to enable us to make enormous progress. And so what I'm hoping, and what I think a lot of other people are hoping, is that we're going to be able to bring the AI and the human qualities to, what you and I would call social entrepreneurship or improvement in society. That's where I think we're going to get to.
I see that another theme of your book is AI is now democratizing who can attempt to solve these problems.
I do think that it is a tool to democratize problem solution. We still have the traditional problems of various kinds of discrimination that reduce the availability of education. But I also think that going back to Nobel Prize winners, maybe it was Herbert Simon, but I think it was more formalized by another Nobel Prize winner named Elinor Ostrom. And Elinor Ostrom advocated for polycentricity. And polycentricity is basically the notion that you work on problems starting at the lowest level, at the local level, and then you build on the local project to increase the scale of the impact. And I think that strategy, AI is the most beautiful tool we've ever had to support local people, in almost every dimension of the problem to advance solutions.
Coming from Madrid, Spain, and Boston, USA, this is the AI-Dialogos podcast, where leaders talk AI. Welcome to AI-Dialogos, joined here with my colleague Teresa Martín-Retortillo. You've had a very distinguished career, played a variety of roles in entrepreneurship. You've built a billion-dollar company, led a major edtech project, won laptop per child at MIT Media Lab. You've been a professor. You continue to be a professor. What we want to do today is do a deep dive on your most recent book. It's not your first book. This is The Second Renaissance. It's actually very inspiring. The subtitle is How AI Will Transform Science, Technology, and Entrepreneurship. Could you say what made you choose the title, The Second Renaissance?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for commenting on the book. And to answer the question, the way I see human history is we had the Greeks in the West who were the foundation for our intellectual pursuits. I think that model was finally updated in the first Renaissance, and those gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, did an excellent job of laying the groundwork for math and basic science. I think today, artificial intelligence is going to have the equivalent or maybe even greater impact than the impact of what the first Renaissance did. So I simply call it the second Renaissance.
Teresa?
And as part of this analogy with the Renaissance, part of what happened in the Renaissance days was actually that whole human development, interdisciplinary, really putting the emphasis on the many dimensions of the human being. Do you think AI is actually opening the door for that?
I think that what AI is going to do is it's going to give us information at new levels, at the level of particles and biomaterials and such things. And that's going to enable us to make enormous progress on a lot of issues that we didn't even have the beginnings of really established. And I think that maybe in 10 years, an awful lot of the issues that are really just efficiency and productivity, AI is going to help us to sort of put them to bed. There'll still be opportunities for entrepreneurship, but we'll make a huge amount of progress. And so what I'm hoping, and what I think a lot of other people are hoping, is that we're going to be able to bring the AI and the human qualities to, what you and I would call social entrepreneurship or improvement in society. That's where I think we're going to get to.
One sort of follow-up question on what Teresa mentioned. So, Bob, the first Renaissance, you emphasized science and technology. However, in your book, humanism plays a strong role. And that also was a characteristic of the first Renaissance. There's a tendency for humanism to be left out when we talk about AI, technology, and entrepreneurship. What's your take on that?
Well, there's a concept that I like very much from a former professor. He's passed away, professor at Stanford named George Polya. And Polya said there's three basic forms of knowledge. There's physics, there's math, and there's philosophy. All right. And so I would politely argue that when we talk about philosophy, we are encouraging the humanistic perspective. And ironically, I began my professional career with only a philosophy degree. And Teresa, you'd like this story especially. The first question when they did the rigorous part of the interview at Chase Manhattan Bank, they asked me what would be the inventory level of Christmas trees. When would it be the highest, all right, as you approached Christmas? And my response was, what's inventory? All right. They hadn't discussed that in philosophy. And somehow I managed to survive that response. I think it was their appreciation for my philosophy and humanistic perspective.
And I guess your openness to ask the direct and essential questions to addressing to giving an answer. So good for you. Good for you.
Perhaps you're absolutely right. And perhaps not ironically, that's becoming increasingly the challenge in, call it, modern thought. AI is, mechanizing so much of, question and answer. We humans are going to add value by the original questions that we ask, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just kind of one more follow-up on the theme of humanism. As we look at what's really happening on the ground, and you're presently at a university, quite a few cuts in programs, at least in the United States. Probably the pressure is going to be worldwide. And it seems to be the case that humanities is on the chopping block. Any sort of thoughts on that? We might proclaim humanities as important, but the reality seems to be we don't give it the type of importance that it might deserve.
Well, when those cuts were first announced, some organizations in Europe reached out to the American academic community and said, come do your research with us and we will fund it. And I thought that was a brilliant offer from Europe. I don't know how many people took them up on it, but I encouraged our faculty to look at it. And I think that the humanism in Europe is more pronounced now than when I was in the third industrial revolution. And I think that's a good message for the entire world.
I will emphasize that point, and hopefully it's not only a European position, but I work at a university institution that actually launched a School of Humanities just barely a couple of years ago on that idea of we cannot be missing out on that. And it's interesting, and we'll love to hear your thoughts on, you talked about there's a lot of conversation around AI and the human factor and rehumanizing. And even students talk about, let's make it human. Let's make it human. So in this tension of AI in the human dimension, are we forced to a trade-off, or can we actually use AI in business and in personal use to enhance what is inherently human?
Well, I think that, the notion of kind of combining social and technical, I'm going to go back to the 1950s and the 1960s and people like Herbert Simon. And I think at the universities, we've always appreciated it. The part that we didn't probably do as good a job as we could have was making the students realize what the construct was and what role it played. But I think that, the good news is that's becoming more and more of a topic. And maybe in the next 5 years, it'll be mainstream. I get a little worried about the universities because so many of them are struggling just with the notion of how do I incorporate AI? and human technical issues are not at the top of the list. But some of the most sophisticated people say that's where you start, and then you work your way down the stack to decide what kind of infrastructure and what kind of power systems you need. And at least the issue's on the table.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift a little bit. Your book is about how AI will transform science, technology, and entrepreneurship. Let's kind of focus on entrepreneurship. You've had a variety of roles in entrepreneurship, building a billion-dollar company. One of the books that you have written is quite well known and used in management schools, building a billion-dollar company. I forget the exact title. Also, your role at MIT Media Lab with the one laptop per child, other experiences with entrepreneurship. What are some key lessons that you've learned over the years?
I think that the single most important issue I've learned is you're probably going to reframe the problem. All right. If you want to have entrepreneurship that can scale, that can have real value, particularly if we get into social entrepreneurship, we have to reframe. And the story that I always tell about reframing a problem goes back to Indonesia. One day, a man came in from Jardine Fleming, which at the time was the biggest investment bank in Asia outside Japan. And he said to us, we would like to make an investment in your company. We'd like to invest in the equity of your company. And there were 5 Indonesian guys and me and the man from Jardine. And all 5 Indonesians simultaneously said it's against the law in Indonesia to have foreign ownership of a retail company. And, everybody kind of deflated after they said that. And then Hacker said to the guy from Hong Kong, could we do a convertible debenture? And of course he said yes. And we did the first convertible debenture in Indonesian history, I think. We raised $20 million. And that was the money that led to the billion-dollar company. And I didn't break the law. I just reframed the problem.
On this idea of AI entrepreneurship, and again, maybe just really interested in hearing your perspective about some of the myths or big ideas that AI would really allow now to have a redefined entrepreneurship and allow the sort of the one entrepreneur shop.
Yeah.
How much truth is behind this idea and how, but what are your thoughts on that?
I do think that billion-dollar corporations are going to be much less staff than they were in the past, because I think there is a huge opportunity for efficiency and productivity that's going to eliminate what most likely will be the lower-level jobs, which unfortunately is going to include undergraduates, which is why I encourage them all to study AI. I think that every industrial revolution has shown us, a dip where jobs go down and then usually a really strong uptick to the point where we have more jobs than we started with. And I don't see any reason why AI, with all its versatility, couldn't produce the same thing. I'm an optimist about AI. I think that, the concerns about the ethics and the job loss and, some of the other social issues, I'm going to call it growing pains. Not that it's not worthwhile to have discussion, but I think we're going to reconcile it.
Just kind of pushing back on this idea, is AI redefining entrepreneurship potentially to make it not only about reframing problems, but also allowing 1, 2, 3 individuals to solve new problems by themselves? And I'm thinking about, there are a number of examples in the press these days, but I'm thinking about Matthew Gallagher starting this company with $20,000.
Yeah.
Now, voicing $400 million, and I'm tracked to be 1.8 billion. Is that paradigm of entrepreneurship changing?
I'm going to argue no.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to argue no. I'm going to argue that we need to start with insight. We still need to go to sort of Osterwalder's model, all right, of the business model canvas, and that what's going to come out is the tangible application of the model, ideally to help society and return money to shareholders. Some people are more talented than others. I might need a team of 20. This gentleman that went to 400 million in 1 year by himself obviously didn't. So,
okay.
I think that there's still value in teaching entrepreneurship. I think we have to almost incorporate applied AI in any entrepreneurship course.
Okay.
So you can't miss it. But I'm a believer that the process is not going to change.
I hear you.
We'll need business schools, Teresa.
Let me use this segue to go into another topic in your book, social entrepreneurship. and the concept of shared value and mechanisms to actually distribute the wealth.
Right.
Just tell us more about the meaning of social entrepreneurship. And Phil, I want to ask you, what is the most inspiring social entrepreneur that you have encountered?
Well, the most inspiring social entrepreneur that I've encountered is Muhammad Yunus, right? And he did get a Nobel Prize, and I think he's one that clearly deserved it. It was such an excellent model for humanity. The notion of social entrepreneurship, I've been teaching since 2009. I was really fortunate that, somebody came to me and said, "You teach entrepreneurship. Can you teach social entrepreneurship?" And my response was, "What's that?" Okay. And, having spent some time at MIT by then, I knew enough to go understand the fundamentals, and it's worked out pretty well, because the One Laptop Per Child project was probably the second largest project in the world when Muhammad Yunus was number one, is my guess.
Oh, wow.
All right. And what I did was convert it from a donative model to social entrepreneurship. And we had quite a bit of success selling the computers when we finally acknowledged that that's what we needed to do.
So let's unpack this distinction that you make between traditional versus social entrepreneurship. I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of the book. And I'll love to read a quote from that. You say that the distinction is, it's not just the types of problems that one chooses to solve, but how the value created is split between the users and the providers of the solution. And then I really like this quote: "The social entrepreneur maximizes value shared. The traditional entrepreneur maximizes value captured." So unpack a little bit, elaborate on this idea. There are really two ideas in those quotes. One is the types of problems that we choose to solve. That's kind of understandable, but I think you go further. The social entrepreneur maximizes the value shared. What do you mean by that? And can you kind of give us some examples?
Okay. The value shared being maximized is first an explicit recognition that the people you're working with are probably disadvantaged. So they have a multiplicity of problems, issues, and drawbacks. So as much as you can, you want to be sort of open-minded about where you're trying to help. Secondly, I think that, there's a few basic problems that have to be addressed, and we still haven't addressed them. And I think that's where social entrepreneurship should focus. So things like education, healthcare, water, the environment, those are important areas to work on. One of the issues that I have with social entrepreneurship is there are a lot of examples, but people don't realize the power of scaling. All right. You have a small community project and you help 50 people. That's very nice, very beneficial. I appreciate it. I applaud you. When are you going to the next 50 people, right? Or when are you going to cover the state of Florida? I think that we have to put as much emphasis on the word entrepreneurship as we do on social. And what I say is, I've been saying this for 20 years. I'm going to say it for another 20 years, hopefully, is within the next 20 years, I expect entrepreneurship to include social entrepreneurship. So we won't talk about social. It'll just be entrepreneurship.
And so you put on the foreground the idea of scaling. So good, we can consider entrepreneurship that delivers for 50 people to 100 people, but really the central concept of an entrepreneur is someone who is driven to scale. So from what you've seen in your experience, what's your advice? If someone wants to be a social entrepreneur, what are the lessons about scaling?
Well, I think the first lesson is you conceive your concept with an explicit recognition that the objective is scale. And what that leads to is a much simpler business model, much simpler product that you need to go out and test and validate in your first project or your first test. I think that people try to solve every problem for a community when they have a social project, and that, regrettably, that's never going to work as well as 10 separate projects, each addressing an issue. In fact, I think the Rockefeller Foundation is a historic example where they recognized that yes, a problem might have several components, but let's get projects that address each component individually. That to me was very, very powerful idea that I should probably give more credit to the Rockefeller Foundation for.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of coming back to AI, how does AI help with this scaling problem? If so, how?
Well, I think AI potentially helps because it's naturally designed to scale. All right. So if you build your infrastructure around AI, in effect, at least your infrastructure is ready to scale without a lot of adjustment. So that's helpful. I think that you have the potential to capture information that perhaps has never been captured before when you do social entrepreneurship. That information is going to be reasonably well organized if you're running a good AI-based social entrepreneurship company. So I think the ability to share that information or, to write books or do whatever you think is constructive, I think that's going to go way up. It may not be the CEO, but it might be somebody who's interested in sharing. And I think that the other thing that AI is going to do is it's going to let senior management focus on where they are going to add value. They're not going to have to worry so much about operations and such matters, supply chain, things like that. They're going to be able to focus on the value. How do we get to the next countries? How do we move from South America to Africa? That is not simple. Right. So I think it's going to be very helpful that there's probably a good book there, AI and social entrepreneurship.
All right. So let's come back to what I think are the bold and boldest ideas in your book. I think the first bold idea is that AI expands the frontier of tractable problems. I think this is in chapter 9. See if I can. Your words are messy problems, UN scale problems, and deep tech. So as I see it, what you're advocating is, hey, look, this is a very exciting time to be alive, to be an entrepreneur. One reason for that is the class of problems that are now tractable has expanded. With AI, you can go after these messy problems. Can you say about that? And am I capturing your intent?
Right. Well, I came across what you're calling wicked problems when I went to work at the Media Lab, and they had an expression which was the impossible problems.
Yeah.
And they said that the Media Lab worked on impossible problems, and no one ever had to ask what were the impossible problems. I think that deep tech and impossible problems, or deep tech and wicked problems, are actually different issues. All right. I think deep tech is pushing the frontier between science and engineering. So maybe we could say that quantum is an example. And that we've been doing that for hundreds of years, thank you, and we'll be fine. But I think that you're absolutely right in saying that AI is potentially a terrific tool to bring to bear on these impossible, wicked problems. In fact, that's what I think it's going to end up making its mark on history by addressing those social issues, or helping us to address those social issues.
Right. So coming back to the social entrepreneurship is, if you could say it, your call to arms would be, hey, look, folks, we now have potentially the tools to solve really hard social problems using AI.
That is what I believe. I think that that's where we're going.
And then the second related theme is, we might think that these hard, intractable problems are really for large labs, universities, research institutions. But I kind of see that another theme of your book is AI is now democratizing who can attempt to solve these problems. Is that?
I do think that it is a tool to democratize, problem solution. We still have the traditional problems of various kinds of discrimination that reduce the availability of education. But I also think that, going back to Nobel Prize winners, maybe it was Herbert Simon, but I think it was more formalized by another Nobel Prize winner named Elinor Ostrom. And Elinor Ostrom advocated for polycentricity. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And polycentricity is basically the notion that you work on problems starting at the lowest level, at the local level, and then you build on the local project to increase the scale of the of the impact. And I think that strategy, AI is the most beautiful tool we've ever had to support local people, in almost every dimension of the problem to advance solutions.
And wasn't Ostrom's work also tied to the commons?
Yes. Yeah. That's where she started.
Yeah.
I think. And I think that Herbert Simon was advancing his thinking, and I think she was reading Herbert Simon, and then she put her own very appropriate focus on how to do it with the notion of polycentricity, and eventually even came back to acknowledging that polycentricity was really nothing more than an example of a complex adaptive system. Right, which is, a point that people don't seem to realize, which is that all of our natural problems and all of our man-made problems are actually susceptible to the same framework for solution. And that's a concept that needs almost as much popularizing as as artificial intelligence.
Okay. Well, I'd like to wrap this up. And I'm going to ask two questions, concrete ones, and then give Teresa an opportunity to ask two of her own.
Okay.
And my two questions are, suppose question number one, a student comes to you during office hours and says, I want to be an entrepreneur. What's your advice? And the second one, related one, I'm a college president and I want to stimulate entrepreneurship in AI. What's your advice to me? Okay, so
well, remind me of the second question because I will have forgotten by the time I answer the first.
The first one is the student coming in and says, give me advice about entrepreneurship. The second one is the college president.
All right. I get that question frequently. All right. And what's interesting is I would say that 9 out of 10 times it's a young woman, which I think is tremendously encouraging. My first response usually is, well, entrepreneurship is based on solving problems. So why don't we start just for fun by you telling me what's the biggest problem in your life? And then maybe we can think about how to find a solution. All right. So I try and make it very personal. I try to make it a domain that doesn't scare them. If I say we have to work in nuclear physics, they never come back. Yep. Right. It's that kind of, nurturing approach that's really critical. I mean, I do use the business model canvas. I'm increasingly becoming fond of the notion of insight before you get to the canvas. There's lots, there's so many good programs that most of the students at our school don't even know about, that it's very helpful just to tell them that, hey, there's 500 incubators in the United States or whatever the number is now. I don't know if
And the college president, what can I as a college president be doing to stimulate and AI and entrepreneur?
Well, I think it was about 2017, I proposed to the then senior management of FIU that we should have a school of artificial intelligence, not think about it as part of computer engineering, but a school of artificial intelligence. And I have the same solution for entrepreneurship. There's one state university in Florida that has a school of entrepreneurship, and I'm really jealous. All right. I think that every major university, I mean, if Harvard can start teaching engineering, well, then, a lot of people should be able to teach entrepreneurship.
That's a great recommendation. I love that you dedicate a couple of chapters to the idea of business model and business model evolution, or how we think about AI actually changing the more traditional definition of business model to guide entrepreneurs through their innovation and problem solving processes. I was surprised by the fact that you add different levels of sort of different wrinkles to the business model canvas. And you do talk about the importance of the tech stack, the importance of the customer experience per se as a variable that needs to be figured out, and the resourcing issue. But I do think, and I'm curious to know, if things move so quickly, in the concept of value capture in a business model, AI is actually opening a new world, a new set of paradigms that are potentially based on different metrics, maybe impact, maybe what are your thoughts on value capturing? Is there any paradigm shift that AI is actually facilitating?
I will admit I haven't given as much thought to it as that question warrants. That's a really, really excellent question. I think the answer is yes, for sure. It's going to open up new value capture opportunities. I mean, it could be just as simple as selling data, all right? And then, there's probably other ways to do it. I think that the people that are offering the Amazon Web Services kinds of things, I think that's a place where they should seriously think about what are the new business models that we could build. Because that might be with the exception of electricity, that might be the key constraint so that, you can't open up a business with one woman, right? And if they thought about the one woman new business, $100 million a year, I think Amazon would probably think about their web services differently.
Yeah. That's a great point.
That might be the reframing or the insight.
That's a great point. Well, thank you, Bob.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And this has been certainly a great conversation.